Welcome to American Ambition, a history podcast about plans, hopes, and visions for the future of the United States. This is episode 2, Missouri and Nullification, the second episode in a series tracking the 19th century political crisis that led to the American Civil War in 1861. We've got plenty to cover today, so I want to jump straight in. Today, in our second episode, we're going to cover some of the major changes that took place in the early American Republic, as well as two major crises that erupted around slavery-related regional political tensions. You'll remember last time that we discussed the importance of the Union to 19th century Americans, as well as the compromises that the Constitutional Convention made in 1787 over how to treat slavery at the national level. We also discussed how scholarly disagreements over this time period tend to be over issues of emphasis. All agree that slavery was the cause of the conflict, but some emphasize long-term ideological antagonism, while others emphasize the similarities between the regions and the role of individual action. Moving on to this episode, we'll be covering the approximately 2 decades between about 1815 and 1835. First, we'll discuss some long-term trends in the American economy and in Americans' religion. Then, we'll talk a bit more specifically about 2 crises in particular: the conflict over the admission of Missouri to the Union, a conflict that peaked in 1820, and John C. Calhoun's innovative doctrine of nullification, which led to the Nullification crisis in 1832. Next episode, we'll cover largely the same span of time, but with a specific focus on the evolution of anti-slavery rhetoric and politics that was occurring simultaneously. Now, by 1815, we're talking about 25 years since the adoption of the Constitution, the United States has added 5 new states: Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Vermont, and Ohio. And this is in addition, of course, to the original 13 colonies. But it's important to remember they did not have North America all to themselves at this point. The Spanish colonial government of New Spain controlled much of what is now the American Southwest. To the north was British Canada. And as I said last week, despite the lines drawn on a map, much of this continent is still very much Indian land. The United States has just concluded a peace with Great Britain in the War of 1812, a conflict whose origins are really beyond the scope of this series, but suffice to say the U.S. had avoided defeat at the hands of their former overlords. Though neither side had really, won the war, the U.S. had reasserted its independence and sovereignty on the international stage. In the years after the War of 1812, the United States was undergoing some significant changes in its economy, and those changes would encourage cultural shifts as well. At this point, a gradual economic upheaval, often known as the Market Revolution, was taking place, primarily in the northern states. This was, in one sentence, a shift from an economy based around subsistence and local barter to a market-based economy with more standardized monetary exchange, commercial farming, industrialization, and wage labor. Where once families had subsisted entirely on the crops and goods their household produced, now they increasingly sold them for cash to buy other necessities. Hired help, be they apprentices or farmhands, had once lived with the family or craftsmen they worked for. Now, more and more, they worked in large workshops, often with other laborers who were paid a cash wage and expected to find their own lodgings. Goods like textiles that had been produced in the home began to be produced in rudimentary factories by armies of young women. Historians debate whether the term revolution is overblown, whether it's really more of an acceleration of trends that were already in motion. But regardless of what you call it, there were major changes afoot in how Americans worked, bought, and sold. This market revolution helped foster the development of a new middle class, especially in the northeastern United States. As the United States economy grew increasingly interconnected and market-oriented, a new crop of managers, lawyers, and middlemen stepped in to facilitate this expanding trade, and they often enjoyed a comfortable prosperity. A defining feature of these folks was a division between work and home. That is, their whole family no longer had to work in and around their house just to survive. Instead, men left to work away from home, and women and children stayed in the home. Now, women were doing lots of work in the home, cooking, cleaning, sewing, raising children, but because this doesn't produce a wage, it doesn't really count as work in this new economy. This new middle class can enjoy a level of material comfort and leisure that previous generations of Americans could not. They have fewer children, as they no longer need every available hand to help them on a farm. This new middle class are also very interested in keeping up moral standards. There's an accompanying boom in books on etiquette, and some of them begin founding voluntary societies for social reform causes, such as encouraging temperance, that is, abstaining from alcohol. Part of the reason these reform societies grow in popularity is due to a major religious movement known as the Second Great Awakening. Dating this is a little hard, but you could generally say it took place between about 1790 and 1840. And this was a movement centered around massive revival meetings. Think Woodstock for pious middle-class folks. And these meetings were focused on personal salvation of individuals through Jesus Christ, a rejection of previous Calvinist teachings that only a select few were chosen for salvation. These revivals crossed denominational lines. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, all of them got in on the game. And these revivals occurred throughout the country. In the South, they were responsible for encouraging Christian faith among many enslaved people. But we're going to stick to the North for a moment, where I want to make two specific points about this movement in general. First, the popularity of these revivals was tied to these changes in the economy that I just mentioned. Areas where the market revolution had brought significant changes to people's lives, these tended to be the places with more and larger revival meetings. And more people in those areas adopted a newfound faith in personal salvation. This is especially clear in upstate New York. The building of the Erie Canal there between 1817 and 1821 brought a huge influx of people and commerce to what had been a relative backwater. Tying the Atlantic Ocean to the Hudson River, to the Great Lakes, within a couple of years, the Erie Canal transformed towns like Rochester and Buffalo from regional hamlets into hubs of commerce. This area, where the market revolution made possibly its largest impact, also saw so many religious revivals that it became known as the burnt-over district, as if the fire of religious passion had swept through again and again until there were no converts left to be made. It also spawned whole new religious movements. The Seventh-day Adventists, known then as Millerites, as well as the Latter-day Saints, commonly known then and now as Mormons, both were founded in this time in upstate New York. Second, these revivals tended to stress post-millennial Christian belief, which would have a huge impact in how the people who imbibed this religion then engaged with the world around them. Post-millennial Christianity stressed the second coming of Christ on earth will not bring about a 1,000-year kingdom of God, as some believed, but instead humans, by enacting God's providential design on earth, could, and indeed must, create God's kingdom, after which, hence the post-millennialism, after which Christ would descend and lead the faithful to heaven. The reason this is important is because you now have a bunch of middle-class folks who have a bit of disposable income and time on their hands and a determination to improve the world around them to bring about the kingdom of heaven. They're going to start a ton of reform societies to promote Christianity, to encourage temperance, to abolish slavery, to prevent work on the Sabbath, really anything they feel will create a moral and godly society. Women in particular become some of the main organizers and foot soldiers of these reform efforts. As the economic function of the family changed for middle-class Americans, that is, no longer did everyone in the family have to work for the family to survive, their conceptions of gender roles changed as well. Previously, the ideal woman had been her husband's right hand at home, managing household production of basic goods, turning the raw materials a farm produced into things that could be eaten, worn, bartered. She's conducting business on his behalf when he's absent. Among this new middle class, however, women were now regarded as virtuous guardians of a peaceful and moral home, distinct from the public, male, rough-and-tumble world of politics and business. In this conception of gender, women were idealized as vessels of virtue, whose primary job was to encourage morality in their children and husbands. The new religion of the Second Great Awakening was also particularly popular with women, and so these new moral reform societies allowed them to combine their new social roles as arbiters of morality with their religious drive to improve the world around them. I want to stress before we move to the southern states that the northern states and America as a whole are still overwhelmingly rural and will remain so for the duration of this series. The market revolution did leave parts of the country more urbanized, and we do see the first true factories pop up, but we're talking about relative increases in urbanization and industrialization here. This new middle class is also relatively small numerically. Most Americans are still farmers at this point. But I'm focusing on this urban middle class because they are a new development and because they had an outsized impact on American politics and culture over the coming decades, especially in the northern states. The slaveholding states had a couple of large towns and cities, Baltimore, New Orleans, Richmond, soon St. Louis. But outside these areas, the effects of the market revolution were more muted in the South. There was a different economic transformation sweeping the region as the South was overtaken by a boom in cotton growing. The cotton gin, invented in the early 1790s, was a relatively simple machine that could easily remove cotton seeds from cotton fiber, making what had been an immensely time-consuming process far easier. Suddenly, cotton was a much more viable crop, and planters throughout the South began switching to it. The wider world, especially England and its textile mills, seemed to have a ravenous demand for cotton, and so production, and with it profit, soared. U.S. production of cotton increased tenfold between 1800 and 1830, and in that year, the U.S. became the world's largest cotton exporter. Now, as production of cotton increased, so did demand for enslaved labor. Enslavers in upper South states like Virginia and Maryland began selling their enslaved people at great profit to slave traders who brought those enslaved people further south, where the cotton boom was really taking off. Some Virginia enslavers had previously been at least theoretically open to ideas for gradual emancipation or some other end to slavery. Years of tobacco planting had left their soil exhausted, and plantation farming wasn't as profitable for them as it had been. They were also affected by the same Revolutionary era appeals to liberty and freedom that had led many in the northern states to begin implementing gradual emancipation laws of their own. The cotton boom changed all of this. Suddenly, enslaved people represented an even more lucrative commodity than ever before that could be sold to cotton growers whose demand for enslaved labor seemed insatiable. As a result, even states with fewer enslaved people became more and more committed to enslavement because those people weren't just laborers. They were an increasingly valuable commodity as well. The importance of slavery and the political and economic power wielded by the wealthiest enslavers also meant that the South did not develop more urban centers as the North did, or invest in major infrastructure projects like the Erie Canal. Many of the richest plantations, and by extension the most influential Southerners, were those on existing rivers that could use easily available water transport to bring their harvests down the coast where it could be sold to a merchant. Those with wealth and influence saw little need to invest in new infrastructure that could not directly benefit themselves or those in their social circle. The economic dominance of the wealthiest enslavers also discouraged immigration, and so the southern states attracted far fewer immigrants. Desperate for economic opportunity and seeing little hope in a South dominated by would-be aristocrats and their enslaved underclass, most immigrants headed north and soon made up a significant block of the emerging northern cities. While both North and South remained overwhelmingly rural, as I mentioned, and the South did develop a couple larger cities where a middle class could develop, these economic changes solidified distinctions between the regions. In essence, the market revolution hit the North hard and changed it, creating new networks of transportation, new social classes, and new modes of production. Meanwhile, the cotton boom caused the southern states to accelerate what they were already doing. More slavery, bigger plantations, more economic activity concentrated in only a few key towns and small cities. Southern wealth was in land and in enslaved people, and so their economy and culture continued to revolve around the rural farm and plantation. As a result of these changes, the southern states were falling behind in population relative to the northern states. Many white Southerners looked at these changes in the North and saw a horror show, society being turned upside down, reformist do-gooders meddling in other people's affairs, a focus on profit and money-making over family and tradition. Similarly, white Northerners looked south and saw people that weren't really keeping up with the times, wannabe aristocrats living as lords in lavish mansions without ever doing a hard day's work in their life. Southerners began to worry that if this trend continued, they would be a permanent minority within their own country, at the mercy of the whims of their northern neighbors who could outvote them on any public issue. Only in the Senate, where an equal number of slave states and free states kept things balanced, could Southerners blunt their neighbors' growing majority. Some Northerners began thinking that maybe they ought to have more of an influence over the government, that the South was less populous and behind the times, and really their political influence is only being propped up by the 3/5 compromise. These growing anxieties came to a head when Missouri applied for statehood in 1819. Americans' hopes and fears for their country's future were focused on the West, even at this early date. The fate of the Western territories that will belong to the United States will consistently serve as a flashpoint for conflict in the years leading up to the Civil War, because Americans, both North and South, believe that the new states that are formed there will determine the future course of the country. The territory of Missouri had been carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. Back in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson had negotiated the purchase with the Emperor Napoleon, who was looking to offload his country's claims to North America in exchange for cash to finance his ongoing wars on the European continent. In the years since 1803, Americans had begun joining the scattered French and Spanish colonists around St. Louis, and some of them had brought enslaved people with them. By the time Missourians applied for statehood in 1819, enslaved people numbered about 15% of Missouri's 65,000 residents. As Missouri's statehood was considered in Congress, Representative James Talmadge of New York attached an amendment to the legislation, which would bar enslaved people from being brought into Missouri after its statehood and would free any enslaved person now living there at the age of 25. Talmadge and his supporters in Congress did dislike slavery for moral reasons, but his primary motivation here was a political one. Talmadge and other Northerners had seen over the last couple decades how the 3/5 compromise had empowered Southern states in the national government. With the help of the extra electoral votes that the compromise granted them, the presidency had been almost entirely occupied by Virginians. First Washington, then Jefferson, Madison, James Monroe, with only the one term of John Adams in there after Washington as an outlier. Talmadge and his supporters felt that had it not been for this 3/5 compromise, Southerners would not have controlled the presidency. Southerners like James Madison would not have been able to, for example, plunge the U.S. into the War of 1812, a conflict that New England, for instance, had generally opposed. And so, Talmadge sought to blunt the power of slaveholding in the federal government by preventing it from taking root in the new state of Missouri. Talmadge and his supporters offered two main arguments as to why such a restriction on Missouri's statehood was constitutional. The first was precedent. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation that preceded the Constitution, had already imposed a similar restriction. In 1787, that Congress had passed the Northwest Ordinance, barring slavery from the United States Northwest Territory, which encompassed much of what we now know as the Midwest: Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, part of Minnesota. As a result, there was no entrenched slavery interest in Ohio, for example, when it entered the Union as a free state. Talmadge encouraged Congress to impose a similar restriction on Missouri, something Congress could do because as long as Missouri was still a territory, it was subject to congressional control. This restriction was similar to the gradual emancipation law adopted in Talmadge's New York state decades earlier. It was, from his perspective, entirely reasonable. Talmadge's supporters also advanced a second, potentially more incendiary argument, however. Article 4 of the Constitution guarantees every state a republican form of government. And some of Talmadge's supporters began to argue that perhaps slavery was not compatible with republicanism, pointing to the text of the Declaration of Independence and some of the founders' general discomfort with slavery. Some congressmen argued that even if the founders had not eliminated slavery, they certainly had not intended that it spread, and it was their duty to stop the expansion of slaveholding. Now, most Southerners were willing to concede, at least rhetorically, that slavery was a necessary evil. It was a relic of colonialism, they said, a curse inflicted on them by the British, but not one with an obvious solution. It was well and good to say that the enslaved must be freed, but how? Surely, many thought, such an uneducated, uncivilized people could not be citizens. And enslaved people outnumbered whites in some places. If freed, could they be trusted to behave peacefully towards those that had enslaved them for their entire lives? The founders had anticipated slavery's gradual demise, they agreed, but gradual was the key word there. Southerners' primary argument in favor of admitting Missouri was what they called diffusion. This was the idea that ending slavery was a challenge because enslaved people were concentrated in such large numbers. In counties like Beaufort, South Carolina, for example, the 1820 census records about 85% of the county's 32,000 residents were enslaved. Beaufort is a bit of an extreme case, but there were counties like that all across the South. As in 1820, the whole third of all Southerners were enslaved. White Southerners feared an enslaved uprising more than anything because they knew that they would be outnumbered in many places and that those they had enslaved had good reason to hate them. The idea of diffusion, then, was that if enslaved people were more widely distributed over the country, then eventually slavery could be ended with minimal potential threat to the white population. I should be very clear, however, that white Southerners' fears about being killed by enslaved people in some future race war were based on their own prejudice against Black Americans. White Southerners commonly imagined that those they enslaved were dumb brutes, prone to violence and vice. They had read of the recent violence in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where enslaved people rose up and established the independent Republic of Haiti, and white Southerners feared a similar revolution in their own land. In fact, not only were Black Americans far smarter than their enslavers gave them credit for, but incidents of retributive violence by emancipated enslaved people were exceedingly rare. All in all, the diffusion idea was an imaginary solution to white Southerners' fears that enslaved people would attack and overwhelm them, but not a real plan to end slavery. While the diffusion solution to slavery enjoyed popularity among white Southerners, there were others who went further. Others who did not want to concede that slavery was an evil, but rather, they argued it was, in the words of diplomat Robert Walsh, a positive good. Some, like Walsh, argued that slavery was good because it relieved the laborer of many the cares of the world. As he put it, an enslaved person, quote, is exempt from those racking anxieties, the exacerbates of despair, to which the English worker and peasant are subject in the pursuit of their pittance, unquote. Others, like South Carolina Senator William Smith, cited biblical texts declaring, quote, Christ himself gave sanction to slavery. He admonished them to be obedient to their masters. While these opinions were not yet popular, it is clear in retrospect that as Northerners tried to thwart the extension of slavery, that some slaveholders had begun to respond by pushing back harder, refusing to concede that slavery might even be a regrettable practice. What was most significant about Southern rhetoric during these debates over the fate of Missouri was how they invoked the specter of disunion. As I said last episode, white Americans shared a belief that their union was a fragile one. And over the course of the antebellum period, public figures invoked this belief by referencing disunion, the idea that the American Union might fail and split apart. Congressman Thomas Cobb of Georgia warned that Northerners, by threatening slavery, had threatened the Union, that they, in his words, quote, kindled a fire which all the waters of the ocean could not put out. Senator Freeman Walker predicted what might happen should Northerners refuse to stop trying to cut off the extension of slavery. Quote, I perceive a brother's sword crimsoned with a brother's blood. I perceive our house wrapped in flames, and our wives and infant children driven from their homes, forced to submit to the pelting of the pitiless storm. Some Northerners, like Senator Walter Lowry of Pennsylvania, claimed that they would welcome such a conflict rather than roll over to enslavers' demands. If, said Lowry, quote, the alternative is, as you gentlemen broadly intimate, the dissolution of this union or the extension of slavery over the whole Western country, I, for one, will choose the former. Now, to be clear, no one here is planning secession or rebellion or actively expects to engage in civil war. They invoke disunion as a terrifying prophecy to cast their opponents as treasonous. The idea is that all agreed that disunion would be terrible, but your political enemies were courting that awful outcome. What seemed on its face to be a relatively mild legislative amendment was interpreted by Southern slaveholders as an assault and caused some to reconsider how they justified the practice of slavery. Many more interpreted this as an unprecedented attempt by the federal government to enforce policies on states, beginning a trend by which states' rights became a distinctively Southern rallying cry. North Carolina politician Nathaniel Macon raised alarms about federal power while discussing an infrastructure bill, saying, quote, if Congress can make canals, they can emancipate, unquote. That is, he warned if Congress is given too much power, they will eventually have the power to emancipate Southerners' slaves. Eventually, Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky negotiated a compromise to avoid further conflict over Talmadge's amendment. Missouri would retain slavery, but Congress would adopt a new anti-slavery rule for the territories. This stated that there would be no new slave states admitted from the territories of the Louisiana Purchase above Missouri's southern border. Additionally, Massachusetts' territory of Maine would be admitted to the Union as well as a free state to keep the balance between slave states and free states in the Senate. With this compromise, the U.S. staved off any further intensification of hostilities, but as we can see, those compromises over slavery at the Constitutional Convention had not solved the issue of slavery's place in American politics, but rather just set the rules for the next round of fighting. Thomas Jefferson was still alive, watching this all go down, and viewed this compromise as a sign that the Republic would fail. Arguing over slavery, he wrote, alarmed him like a, quote, fire bell in the night, and he warned that the drawing of a line dividing the country between slave and free would only further exacerbate these tensions. Jefferson died in 1826, on the 4th of July, in fact, and so these tensions would be left to future leaders to unravel. And these future leaders would be chosen by a broader electorate than many of Jefferson's contemporaries had imagined. Another major change that was going on along with our economic and religious change was the expansion of the right to vote throughout the United States. This happened on a state-by-state basis as each determined their own voting laws. But over the course of the first couple decades of the American Republic, many states started dropping property requirements for voting eligibility. States were in the midst of redefining who would get to vote, and the only qualification that one needed besides residency was that you were a white man. States began removing property restrictions on voter eligibility as early as 1802 in Maryland, but while they expanded the right to vote for some, they restricted it from others. Maryland banned free black people from voting in 1810. New York followed suit in 1821. North Carolina did so as well in 1835. Women had the right to vote in New Jersey so long as they owned sufficient property, but in 1807 women were disqualified from voting there. I won't read you more and more dates. I think my point is clear. There's a shift in who got to be the base of political power in the U.S. No longer was it anyone who held land. Now it was simply, are you a man? Were you white? The guy who became the biggest immediate beneficiary of these changes is someone you have probably heard of, General-turned-President Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a wealthy lawyer and slave owner, originally from the Carolinas, but who made his name in Tennessee. When he was elected to the presidency in 1828, he was the first president who did not come from an established, well-off family, and the first whose political base was on the western side of the Appalachians. He played on this image of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of Westerner to really great effect. Though he grew up poor, he married well. His marriage to Rachel Donaldson in 1794 helped firmly establish him among the Tennessee elite. And he bounced from job to job, congressman, senator, judge, eventually becoming a general in the Tennessee militia. In this capacity, he became a war hero, first fighting the Creeks, and then during the War of 1812, famously defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson was also known for fighting numerous duels, a fact that, if you liked him, spoke to his no-nonsense approach to life. And if you didn't like him, this just showed how violent and uncivilized he was. Andrew Jackson ran for the presidency in 1824, and he won, kind of, but not actually. What he won was 41% of the vote in a four-way race, but he did not have a majority in the Electoral College, and so the race was determined by the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, the Missouri Compromise guy, was the Speaker of the House, and he did not like Jackson at all. Plenty of people did like Jackson. Like I said, he won a plurality of the votes. He had the most votes of any candidate. But Clay and many others thought he was a violent, imperious megalomaniac who shouldn't be anywhere near the reins of government. And so Clay whipped votes for diplomat John Quincy Adams, who had finished second behind Jackson with 31% of the vote. With Clay's support, the House chose Adams as president. Then Adams promptly chose Clay as his Secretary of State, which at the time was a major stepping stone to the presidency. Jackson was furious about this. He was convinced that Adams and Clay conspired against him, that Clay had cut a deal to thwart him and secure his own presidential ambitions. Jackson was angry because he did, after all, get the most votes, and he saw Clay's actions as indicative of a conspiracy against himself as well as a betrayal of the people's will. After stewing over this for 4 years, he eventually beat Adams next time, becoming president in 1829. Henry Clay, meanwhile, was elected to the Senate, where he will remain more or less for the next 20 years. Now, I'm telling you all this because the conflict between Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay establishes America's first real political parties. The Democrats centered around Jackson, and the Whigs centered around Clay. Back in the founding era, political parties and partisanship had been seen as a bad thing. But people's values have changed since. After decades of campaigning and politicking, many Americans have come to see partisanship and party loyalty as a virtue, not a vice. The ideal is no longer that you be an independent and rational statesman, but that you're a team player who can be relied on to toe the party line. So what was the party line? What did these parties stand for? The Democrats are an alliance of rich Southern enslavers and poor Northern workers, engineered by New York politician Martin Van Buren. Rejecting much of the change brought by the market revolution, Democrats wanted more land for white settlement so that poor whites could own their own farms and rich whites could build bigger and bigger plantations. They did not care to have some meddlesome, pious do-gooder tell them not to drink or duel, and they certainly didn't care for the government to be building roads and canals just so some rich merchant could get richer. Democrats thought that in an ideal world, America would be full of honest farmers who worked for themselves or had slaves to do their work for them, and that the government should more or less leave everyone alone. The Whigs formed an opposition to Jackson's Democrats, and even their name is an allusion to Jackson. The Whig Party in England traditionally opposed the wishes of the monarchy, and so the Whigs in America saw themselves as opposed to Jackson, the tyrant would-be king. The Whigs' big thing is improvement. They want an activist government that will try to change America for the better. They think the market revolution is opening up some fantastic new opportunities, and that the government ought to help it along by financing infrastructure projects, canals, roads, harbor improvements, eventually railroads. This clearly would appeal to merchants and manufacturers of all stripes, And some Whigs think people can be improved as well, so this is where those middle-class evangelical reformers I mentioned end up. They want to expand education, eliminate urban vices like prostitution, and curb what they see as deviant social behavior, such as drinking and dueling. As part of this, they really think that everyone ought to observe a certain decorum. They don't like anything too out of the mainstream, which includes Catholicism and immigrants. These two parties will fight for the next 30 years. To keep things simple, I think it's best to think of the Democrats as wanting quantity while the Whigs want quality. Democrats wanted a big country, rapid expansion of the U.S. into the West, lots of immigration to quickly build the U.S. into a big, powerful country of farmers. While Whigs agree that the U.S. must expand, they would prefer a slower, more deliberate pace. They want to improve what they have in front of them before taking more. And they want to make sure new Americans are the right sort, so that their big new country can be properly tied together. Like any political parties, there's some of, if he says up, I say down to the whole thing, but they did just see things differently. Whigs tended to support banks, for example, as necessary financiers of the infrastructure projects that would turn America into a prosperous hub of commerce and industry. Democrats saw banks as bastions of privilege, money-making machines for privileged elites who leached wealth from the honest working men. Whigs saw Andrew Jackson as a demagogue and a bully, an uneducated warlord who had failed upwards until somehow he ran the country. Democrats saw him as a brave frontiersman, a friend of the common man, a national hero, and a bold leader who tells it how it is. These parties represented not just different ideas of how America should grow, but different value systems entirely. Now, we could spend a whole episode, or two, or four, a whole series, really, on Andrew Jackson's presidency. The campaign he and Adams waged in 1828 was the bitterest presidential contest to date. When Jackson's wife Rachel died shortly before he assumed office, he attributed her death to stress caused by his enemies relentlessly publicly attacking her as a bigamist. Jackson's Secretary of War married a woman named Margaret Peggy O'Neill, who the ladies of Washington deemed low-class and promiscuous, and this caused a major kerfuffle in the presidential cabinet, which Jackson actively inserted himself into. He carried on a fight with Nicholas Biddle, the man who ran the Bank of the United States, sort of like the Federal Reserve, and this culminated in Jackson removing the bank's charter and redistributing its funds to other banks of his choosing. The Indian removal effort he started to force the Cherokee and other southern tribes to abandon their lands in the Deep South is something we'll discuss at the end of today's class. Throughout all of these crises and scandals, an important through line is that Jackson views himself as the manifestation of the people's will as expressed through majoritarian democracy, and that anyone who opposed him is an enemy who sought to thwart his power as president as well as the wishes of a majority of the people. One of the many conflicts simmering in Jackson's presidency was a Cold War between his Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren, and his Vice President, John C. Calhoun. Van Buren, I briefly mentioned before, was a New Yorker and the main political wire puller behind Jackson's campaigns and the formation of the Democratic Party. While Van Buren would eventually succeed Jackson as president, his greatest impact in American history is in orchestrating the development of partisan politics by encouraging political alliances across economic classes and regions, creating a shared political party that would advance a preset agenda. Calhoun was, like Van Buren, a career politician, having entered Congress when he was 28. But while Van Buren was a pragmatist trying to balance the interests of different factions and regions in order to win political power, Calhoun was a hardliner in favor of slavery and Southern interests. Calhoun was a South Carolinian and convinced that his state and region was rapidly losing influence at the federal level, influence that he believed needed to be protected. Now, the particular target of Calhoun's anger was a tariff, a tax posed on imported goods that Adams' administration had passed at the end of his presidency in 1828. Part of the point of the tariff was that the growing industrial sector of the U.S. economy, concentrated primarily in northern and eastern states like Adams and Massachusetts, that this industrial sector should be protected from competition from Britain. Britain had gotten a real jump in the whole industrialization thing, and people like Adams and Clay worried that if Britain were allowed to sell their manufactured goods in the U.S., they would be able to undercut U.S. producers driving American manufacturers out of business and leaving the U.S. dependent on Britain for its supply of anything from firearms to fabric. While having a strong manufacturing sector would be just good for the American economy, there was also safety to consider. If the U.S. went to war with Britain again, as it had twice in its already relatively short existence, it might suddenly find its supplies of gunpowder and cotton fabric cut off, with no ability to make their own, and they would find it very hard then to arm and clothe an army. Accordingly, Adams' administration passed a tariff in 1828 that put a stiff tax on imported goods from Britain in order to protect American industry. Calhoun and his fellow South Carolinians thought this was all bullshit and began referring to the 1828 tariff as the, quote, tariff of abominations. Put simply, they thought it was unfair, how the tariff seemed to favor Northern interests. So unfair, in fact, that they argued it was unconstitutional. South Carolina was a unique state. For one thing, it had bought into cotton completely. In other slaveholding states, there were regions of the state, usually in the hillier and more mountainous districts in the north and west, where slaveholding was less common. And these areas of more numerous smaller farmers clashed with the few rich, large landowners who owned most of the enslaved people. But in South Carolina, both the upland and lowland regions had succumbed to cotton mania. White South Carolinians were almost to a man all in on slavery and cotton. South Carolina also had a unique political culture. It had the strictest property qualifications to serve in the state legislature of any state in the Union, meaning its lawmakers were by definition drawn only from the small cadre of the wealthiest enslavers. That legislature was also given more power than any other state legislature, electing the governor, judges, and presidential electors. This means that there was no popular vote for the presidency. The only South Carolinians who got to do that were the wealthy few elected to the legislature. If you go back and look at maps of presidential election returns from before the Civil War, you'll often see that South Carolina is just blank because there was no popular election. The ruling slaveholder elite of South Carolina had the most unquestioned political power of the elites in any state, and they were worried they were losing their power on the national stage. South Carolina's economy was threatened by volatile cotton prices and westward migration into the Deep South, where new cotton plantations were being established that would compete with theirs. The northern states were only growing more and more populous, and some northern people, who we'll talk about next episode, seemed more and more hostile to slavery. Even Virginia, in the wake of a recent slave rebellion, again, something we'll talk about next week, had gone apostate and considered the possibility of emancipation. South Carolinians sold much of their cotton to British merchants, and they worried that if British traders couldn't profitably sell their goods on American shores, they would also be less likely to buy U.S. cotton. To white South Carolinians, it felt like the federal government was putting its thumb on the scale, favoring the interests of the industrializing North over the agrarian South. They felt this made the tariff unconstitutional. The Constitution authorized Congress to enact tariffs to collect revenue, but, some South Carolinians argued, the point of this tariff was not to make money for the government, it was to protect certain Americans' prosperity at the expense of others. I want to emphasize here that, well, we know that much of the 19th century will be dominated by the increasingly rapid pace of industrialization, the use of steam and coal and oil to fuel ever larger and larger factories and machines that will proliferate manufactured goods and human misery across the United States and Europe. These South Carolinians do not know this. From their perspective, slavery is modernity. Slavery is the future. Slavery is the best, indeed the only basis for the future of white civilization. From their perspective, these Northerners are making a tragic mistake. They're investing in industries that turn white people into little more than quote-unquote wage slaves, poorly, uneducated brutes whose employers pay them a pittance and then kick them to the curb. Under slavery, however, white Southerners believed, no white person could occupy the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder because that's where the enslaved belonged. This new world of commerce and industry was some newfangled fad. South Carolinians believed in land and hierarchy, and they were rewarded as the world bought every bit of cotton they could sell. This, South Carolinians believed, was the future. For all of the Northerners' smug sense of superiority, they would have to realize this, eventually. But anyway, back to Calhoun. Calhoun is important because he gives voice to South Carolinians' frustrations by proposing and advocating the constitutional process of nullification and interposition. As expressed in the South Carolina Exposition, a proclamation adopted by the South Carolina legislature and ghostwritten by Calhoun, nullification was a constitutional theory that a state, in its capacity as a sovereign power, could hold a convention and then declare a federal law null and void within its territory if that law threatened its essential interests. Then, a convention of all the states would assemble and try to come up with a compromise. If one could not be found, and if 3/4 of the other states agreed that the new law was constitutional, the nullifying state would be left with two options: comply with the law or secede. Calhoun was always at great pains to point out that his doctrine of nullification was meant to strengthen the Union. The point of the multiple conventions was to give time for passions to cool, for reasonable men to come to reasonable terms. He was, as he saw it, laying out a way for states to solve their problems within the Union, with secession only a last resort. While Calhoun continued to say this, many of his followers took his ideas in other directions, seeing in nullification a justification for secession. Now, some of you may have read the Constitution, and you may be thinking to yourself, I don't remember nullification being in there. And, well, you'd be right. None of these multiple conventions are in the Constitution. Neither is the word nullification. So where is all of this coming from? Calhoun is drawing on a line of constitutional reasoning expressed in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798, two declarations ghostwritten by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They were written in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which you may have heard of, but is really beyond our purview. The point is, Madison and Jefferson opposed them. They thought they were unconstitutional, and they thought states had an obligation to declare laws that violated the Constitution to be unconstitutional. These documents, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, were the foundation of the compact theory of the U.S. Constitution. The idea being that despite the Constitution's preamble beginning, we the people, etc., that in fact the states themselves were the parties to the Constitution, and that the states were sovereign entities, joined together only in a contract by the Constitution. Calhoun is basically taking these ideas and putting his own spin on them, declaring his ideas to be constitutional and kind of just daring anyone to tell him and the rest of South Carolina that they weren't. Well, guess who thinks nullification isn't constitutional? Jackson. Now, Jackson is a Southern slave owner, sure, but he's not scared for the future of slavery the way the South Carolinians are. This all seems a bit hyperbolic to him. More to the point, he's a military man, and despite the fact that he had serious issues with John Quincy Adams, he does mildly support the tariff on a national security grounds. More to the point, Jackson had begun to suspect that Calhoun was conniving behind his back, and that he would like to be president himself. Jackson was also just a patriot and a unionist, and he saw the South Carolinian nullifiers as self-interested whiners. In 1832, Congress decided to reset the tariff rates back to what they had been in 1824, before the adoption of the so-called Tariff of Abominations. But this isn't good enough for the South Carolinians anymore. They hold their nullification convention, declare the tariff unacceptable, and lay down the gauntlet. Reduce the tariff, or we walk. Calhoun resigns the vice presidency to go lead this effort in his home state. South Carolina militias began stockpiling weapons to resist the government. Jackson would have none of this. In late 1832, he denounced nullification in a public letter to South Carolinians. Quote, "Reasoning on this subject is superfluous," Jackson declared. Quote, "When the Constitution declares that the laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land." South Carolinians had been misled by demagogues, Jackson declared, who had, quote, "appealed to your passion, your state pride, your native courage, and your sense of real injury." This was all a ruse, he warned, for soon, quote, the mask which concealed the hideous features of disunion will be taken off. Be not deceived by names, Jackson warned, quote, disunion by armed force is treason. With Jackson ready to crack skulls, Henry Clay again stepped in and offered a negotiated settlement. South Carolina would get a still lower tariff, but the passage of that tariff was accompanied by a force bill, authorizing Jackson to use military force to ensure compliance. When no other state took up South Carolina's cause, the Carolinians resolved to take this carrot-and-stick deal, and the conflict, for the time being, was resolved. So why did the crisis not come to blows? Why did a civil war not break out right here and now in 1832? The most significant reason is that Southern slaveholders did not share the South Carolinians' panic that they were about to be politically eclipsed. As I mentioned, slaveholders like Jackson just didn't see the tariff as a threat to slavery. Slaveholders in new western states like Mississippi and Alabama were establishing states that were growing. They were confident of future prosperity. Most slaveholders had every hope that slavery would continue to flourish in the United States. Only South Carolina, which gave so much power to the wealthiest elites, those who worried most about losing their privileged place, only there could they get so worked up to threaten secession, and when they did, nobody else joined them. Things would play out very differently once more Southerners began to share the South Carolinians' view of things. Now, while white South Carolinians were in the midst of rejecting federal power, their neighbors in Georgia embraced it. While South Carolinians stockpiled firearms and makeshift arsenals to prepare to resist federal forces, white Georgians welcomed soldiers into their state. The reason for this difference is clear. South Carolina whites believed that if the U.S. Army arrived, it would be to deprive them and their state of their rights under the Constitution, while Georgians knew that the arrival of the U.S. Army meant the forceful removal of the thousands of American Indians who still lived within the borders of the state. Over the course of the 1830s, the U.S. government engaged in a deliberate program of ethnic cleansing, forcibly removing the last 60,000 Indians from 5 major tribes to a designated Indian territory in what is now Oklahoma. Some 15,000 Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and other Indians died in the course of what is later dubbed the Trail of Tears. White squatters had been encroaching on native lands in what was now the Deep South for decades. Treaties signed as recently as the 1810s guaranteed native sovereignty over the land they still possessed and required the federal government to remove white trespassers. As president, Jackson ignored these treaties and used his powers to erode native rights to their land. Jackson and other American leaders were so convinced that Indians could not on their own produce anything that he and other white people were recognized as civilization. Putting aside that there were historical examples of vast Indian polities from the Andes to the Valley of Mexico to the Mississippi, there was an example right in front of Jackson's eyes of this very thing. The Cherokee people of northern Georgia had developed an alphabet for their language, produced a written constitution, and founded a capital town where the government under that constitution met. They produced a bilingual newspaper, they built their own schools, but Jackson wasn't interested in any of that. This is important because it puts a lie to the arguments that Jackson and others will make that this whole removal process was about advancing progress or quote-unquote civilizing Indians. Here was full proof, in front of their eyes, of an Indian polity that met all of the conventional standards of white civilization. Educated, literate, representative government. They even held slaves. But Jackson and other proponents of Indian removal did not care. The 1830 Indian Removal Act, signed by Jackson, allowed him to exchange Southern tribes' lands east of the Mississippi for a third as much land west of it. This act conveniently was passed less than 2 years after gold was discovered in the Cherokee lands. The Cherokee actually won 2 major Supreme Court cases recognizing their existing claims and treaties, but Jackson simply ignored these decisions. Jackson's administration negotiated new treaties with unauthorized Indian representatives and proceeded with forced removal. The lands the Jackson administration and that of his ally Martin Van Buren, who followed him in the presidency, The lands that they forced Southern Indians to give up would become prime land for the expanding slave labor cotton economy of the Deep South. So, to recap briefly, over the course of the first decades of the Republic, there were major changes in how Americans worked and prayed. Wage labor, early industrialization, and a shift to more market-based cash economy created a new middle class in some northern states. In the South, cotton mania took off, and America became the world's largest exporter of that crop. Americans also gathered around new forms of worship that stressed a personal salvation through an experience with God. The Missouri Crisis over whether to admit that state marked the first major confrontation of regional hostility over slavery. Some Northern representatives sought to prevent the spread of slavery, while most Southern congressmen argued that such an attempt was an attack on their way of life. A compromise that kept the number of slave and free states balanced also promised the whole northern portion of the Louisiana Purchase for free settlement. Nullification was the product of a unique political culture in South Carolina, a state that was nearly half enslaved, and whose ruling elites feared the erosion of slaveholding power in the United States. They felt a tax on imports unfairly favored Northern interests over theirs, and followed John C. Calhoun down the road to nullification, declaring the tariff unconstitutional. When no one else took up their cause, however, they ultimately backed down. American Ambition is written and performed by me, Stefan Lund, and edited and produced by Luke Vancleave. Our theme music is also by Luke. Thanks for listening, and join us on our next episode where we'll be discussing the growing anti-slavery movement in the United States and how they work to spread their message in the face of stiff, sometimes violent, opposition.